It's 4 a.m. on a freezing winter morning in 1250 CE, and you're a 23-year-old woman who was captured 3 years ago during a raid on your village. You wake on a cold stone floor in the basement of a merchant's house in Venice. Your back still bears scars from last month's beating. You haven't seen your family since the day armed men dragged you away. Today, like every day, you'll work from before sunrise until after sunset, cooking, cleaning, and serving a master who legally owns you as property. Welcome to life as a medieval slave. It's not quite what the history books often tell you. Today, we're diving into what daily existence was actually like for enslaved people across medieval Europe. And I'm warning you right now, this is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. We're talking about a thriving slave trade that lasted centuries, brutal working conditions, the constant threat of violence, and a legal system that treated human beings as commodities worth less than horses. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth, because if you think slavery disappeared after the Roman Empire fell, medieval slaves would like a word: the hidden reality of medieval slavery. For generations, historians believed slavery had essentially vanished from Christian Europe during the Middle Ages. This was a comforting narrative that painted medieval society as fundamentally different from the slave societies of antiquity or the later Atlantic slave trade. But recent scholarship has shattered this myth completely. Slavery was widespread across medieval Europe, thriving in interconnected trade networks that spanned the Mediterranean and beyond. Medieval slavery existed in every corner of Europe, from the British Isles to the Italian city-states, from Iberia to the Black Sea coast. The Visigothic Code in 7th century Spain contained extensive regulations governing slave ownership, behavior, and punishment. Viking raiders captured and sold thousands of people from across Eastern Europe. The Italian cities of Venice and Genoa became major slave trading centers. Malta operated as a slave market until 1798. Even supposedly Christian kingdoms that officially discouraged the enslavement of fellow Christians found ways around these restrictions. The scale was staggering. At markets in Mecklenburg in northern Germany, several hundred Danish prisoners of war could be sold in a single day. More than 1 million Eastern Europeans were enslaved through the Crimean slave trade. White European slaves commanded premium prices in Al-Andalus, selling for as much as 1,000 dinars. In Constantinople, a slave's price ranged from 20 to 25 nomisma. In 14th century Cyprus, Turkish slaves sold for approximately 36 ducats per person. Who became a slave? The paths into slavery were numerous and terrifying. War captives formed the largest source. When armies clashed and cities fell, the losing side faced enslavement. Even Christians could enslave other Christians, if they were prisoners of war, though this was theoretically discouraged. Pagan lands became hunting grounds for slave raiders. The Polabian region, Prussia and Pomerania, supplied countless enslaved people to Christian kingdoms. But war wasn't the only route to bondage. Pirates prowled coastlines, raiding villages and carrying people away in chains. Poverty forced desperate families to sell their children or themselves into servitude. Criminal conviction could result in enslavement. Crushing debt led to bondage when people couldn't pay their obligations. Some were simply born into slavery, inheriting their mother's enslaved status regardless of who their father might be. Religious and ethnic identity played crucial roles in determining who could be enslaved. Generally, Christians, Muslims, and Jews were forbidden from enslaving members of their own faith, though this rule was frequently bent or broken. This created a religious borderland dynamic where anyone outside your faith became fair game. Pagan Slavs were particularly targeted, so extensively that the very word slave derives from Slav. Women were disproportionately enslaved. In late medieval slave markets, female slaves vastly outnumbered males and commanded higher prices. This reflected the primary demand for domestic servants in wealthy urban households, but it also meant enslaved women faced the additional horror of sexual exploitation by their owners. Daily life in bondage. Your daily existence as a medieval slave depended heavily on where you ended up and who owned you. But one truth transcended all regional differences. You had been reduced to property, legally no different from livestock. The vast majority of enslaved people worked in domestic settings, particularly in Mediterranean urban centers. If you were a female slave in a wealthy Venetian or Genoese household, your day began before dawn and didn't end until your master's family retired for the night. You cooked meals over open fires in suffocating kitchens. You hauled water, scrubbed floors, washed mountains of laundry by hand. You served at table, standing silently while your owners ate food you had prepared but would never taste. You cared for children who weren't your own, while your own children, if you had any, remained enslaved elsewhere or were sold away from you. The work was physically exhausting and never-ending. Unlike field laborers who might return to their own quarters at day's end, domestic slaves often lived within their master's house itself. This meant virtually no respite from constant demands. You could be summoned at any hour of the night. Your master's comfort was your only purpose. Agricultural slavery was less common in most of medieval Europe than in earlier or later periods, but it existed. In Venetian Crete, Genoese Chios, and Cyprus, enslaved people labored in vineyards, fields, and sugar mills alongside free workers. The work was brutal. You planted and harvested under dangerous tropical conditions. You cut down acres of sugarcane and transported it to mills. You worked long hours in extreme heat with minimal food and water. Some enslaved people possessed valuable skills that determined their fate. If you knew a trade like carpentry, metalworking, or weaving, you might be put to work in workshops. If you could read and write, you might serve as a scribe or clerk. In Islamic kingdoms, some enslaved people even rose to positions of political influence, though this was rare. The Ottoman Empire pressed thousands into military service. Other slaves were forced to row galley ships, chained to their oars for months at a time. But regardless of your skills or position, you lived with certain universal realities. You owned nothing, not even the clothes on your back. Your master could sell you at any moment, separating you from any family or friends you had managed to hold on to. You had no legal recourse against mistreatment. If you were a woman, your master or his sons could rape you without consequence. The violence and punishment. Medieval slavery was enforced through violence and the constant threat of violence. Scholars examining early medieval sources found that the most extreme forms of corporal punishment were specifically reserved for slaves. In the Frankish kingdoms, Gregory of Tours recorded horrific punishments. Slaves forced to hold lit candles between their legs under threat of death. Slaves who tried to marry buried alive in the same coffin together. The Visigothic Code detailed extensive penalties for slave misbehavior. Iron shackles, chains, and heavy collars were standard tools of control. These restraints weren't just for punishment. They were daily reminders of subjugation, visible symbols that you could be contained and controlled at your master's whim. Running away brought especially harsh consequences. If captured, you faced whipping, branding, mutilation, or worse. Some masters cut off ears to mark escaped slaves. Others used branding irons to permanently mark their property. The 13th century assizes of Jerusalem dedicated significant attention to fugitive slaves and prescribed punishments, including measures to prevent slaves from testifying in court against their owners. Yet despite these brutal consequences, slaves ran away constantly. The historical record is filled with cases of escaped slaves, suggesting that many preferred the terrifying uncertainty of flight to the certainty of continued bondage. Some made it to churches that offered sanctuary, though church officials often returned them to their masters. A few succeeded in reaching towns or territories where they might find protection. One slave escaped from Barcelona all the way to Pamiers in the foothills of the Pyrenees, crossing terrifying mountain terrain to reach a city known for granting refuge. The economics of human property. You weren't a person to your owner. You were an investment. Your value was calculated based on your age, sex, health, skills, and origin. Young women commanded the highest prices. Skilled craftsmen were worth more than unskilled laborers. White European slaves sold for premium prices in Islamic markets. The average household that owned slaves possessed only a few, making each individual economically significant. Owners had to balance the profit you generated through your labor against the cost of keeping you alive. They fed you enough to work, but rarely more. They provided minimal clothing and shelter. They couldn't afford to kill or permanently maim you, because that would destroy their investment, but they could and did push you to the absolute limits of human endurance. Some enslaved people managed to accumulate small amounts of property through a system called peculium, though this legally belonged to their master. Under certain systems like coartation, you might even purchase your own freedom if you could somehow save enough money. But for the vast majority, such hopes were fantasies. You would remain enslaved until you died, or your master freed you. The rare path to freedom. Manumission, the formal freeing of a slave by their owner, did occur, but it was neither common nor guaranteed to transform your life. Masters might free slaves in their wills as acts of supposed piety or gratitude. The Christian Church encouraged manumission as a good deed. Islamic law recommended freeing slaves, particularly those who converted to Islam, though conversion alone didn't guarantee freedom. Some regions allowed slaves to work toward purchasing their freedom over time. In early medieval Islamic society, many slaves served for an average of 7 years before manumission. But these generous scenarios were exceptions. Most enslaved people died in bondage. Even if you achieved freedom, the aftermath was complicated. Freed slaves in most societies remained legally bound to their former masters as clients, owing continued service and loyalty. You carried the stain of servitude that barred you from full participation in society. You might join brotherhoods or guilds composed of other freed slaves, like the Brotherhood of Black Freedom in Barcelona, or the Association of Black African Gondoliers in Venice. But you would never truly escape your past. The children and grandchildren of freed slaves might eventually integrate into society, but it typically took 3 generations for the stigma to fade. Meanwhile, freed women often found their former masters maintained power over them as employers or patrons, continuing a different form of control. Why this history matters. The medieval slave trade was not some minor footnote to history. It was an interconnected system spanning centuries and continents, involving Muslim and Christian kingdoms, Italian merchant republics, Viking raiders, and countless individuals reduced to commodities. The slaves themselves came from every corner of the known world: Slavs, Greeks, Turks, Africans, Arabs, Circassians, Bulgarians. This system helped shape the economic foundations of medieval urban life. It influenced military structures. It affected religious practices and legal codes. The networks and practices developed during the medieval period would later inform and enable the Atlantic slave trade that followed. Understanding medieval slavery also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about history. The Middle Ages were not a simple progression from classical slavery to feudal serfdom to modern freedom. The story is messier, darker, and more complicated. Slavery coexisted with serfdom. Christians enslaved Christians despite prohibitions. Religious piety coexisted with brutal exploitation. Most importantly, this history reminds us that enslaved people existed in every period we study. They weren't abstract statistics or background details. They were individuals like the woman we imagined at the beginning, torn from their families, stripped of their names and rights, forced into labor, subjected to violence, but somehow surviving day after day in circumstances designed to destroy their humanity. Life as a medieval slave was harsh beyond modern comprehension. You worked from before sunrise until after sunset without rest. You endured hunger, cold, and exhaustion. You bore the scars of beatings on your back. You watched as your children, if you had them, inherited your enslaved status. You lived with the knowledge that you could be sold at any moment to someone worse. You died without freedom, often without even a recorded name. But these enslaved people were not passive victims. They resisted through subtle acts of defiance. They ran away despite the risks. They formed communities with other enslaved people. They sought out fractional freedoms through legal systems. They preserved their humanity in a world determined to deny it. If you found this exploration of medieval slavery eye-opening, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the darker corners of medieval history. What other hidden aspects of the Middle Ages should we uncover? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.